All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the STORE lecture. My name is Fred Cheddon, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Charles Pillar. Before I introduce Charles, let me acknowledge that we stand in front of an audience of scientists in training, doctors, clinicians. We stand on the university campus that is dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, the betterment of mankind through the application of the scientific method. Science is one of the most extraordinary endeavors in human societies, has transformed our lives through the ages, bringing countless changes to the way we diagnose and treat illnesses, the way we feed ourselves, the way we communicate, we live, and even our own sense of belonging in the universe. Like many of you here, I'm proud to be a scientist. I love science. That is to say, I love rigorous science. In saying that, I recognize that science is a human endeavor, and as any such endeavor, it can be flawed. Worse perhaps, science is also prone to failures, intentional manipulation, and to outright fraud. 25 years ago, as a postdoctoral fellow, I was faced with a case of scientific fraud. In my own lab, I had to wrestle with the real consequences of the case. It became quickly evident to me that the best way, and the only way, to defend science and to reclaim progress was to shine light onto the case and report it, which I did. Becoming a whistleblower was not easy, and these months were some of the most stressful times of my life. Having a small appreciation for what it takes to investigate and to report scientific misconduct, I am in complete admiration of the work of our esteemed speaker, Charles Pillar. Charles is an investigative journalist for Science magazine. He has previously worked as an investigative reporter for STAT, the Los Angeles Times, the Sacramento Bee. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, and other leading magazines, websites, and newspapers. He has reported on topics related to public health, biological warfare, infectious disease outbreaks. His latest reports, published in a series of Science magazine articles and collected in a recent book, Doctored, exposed a series of shocking scientific fraud cases in the Alzheimer and stroke research fields, spanning both academic, industry, and government research. Charles is a passionate defender of scientific integrity and a thoughtful advocate for supporting rigorous scientific and medical research, even including in a time of rising public distrust, politicization of scientific evidence, and attacks on the scientific enterprise. Charles has received more than 40 honors and awards, including recently the Victor Kahn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting from the Council for the Advancement of Soundwriting, from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Kavli Foundation, the National Institute of Healthcare Management, the Society for Professional Journalists, the National Academies, the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Foundation, the Gerald Loeb Foundation, UCLA, the First Amendment Coalition, the California State University, and other organizations. His work has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize 9 times by STAT, the Los Angeles Times, and the Sacramento Bee. Please join me in welcoming Charles Pillar to UC Davis.
Thanks very much. Can people hear me? Okay, good. So first of all, I'd like to say how honored I am to be invited to give the STORE lecture. I wanted to thank the STORE Endowment, Professor Hygiene, and the Dean as well for their kind invitation. Being a journalist, I am exceptionally privileged and honored to be talking before you, your scientists and future scientists and scientists in training. So thank you again so much. So I'd like to start out with an inspirational quote, but I couldn't find one, so I'll start out with this quote instead. So I'd like to just start basic. Why is the issue of misconduct and sometimes fraud something that we should be concerned about in science, and in particular in neuroscience and in Alzheimer's disease? So it is surprisingly common. And let me state up front that I believe that the vast majority of scientists are honorable and deeply committed to doing ethical research that benefits humankind. And I believe that a small percentage of scientists cut corners or worse, and this is the source of a lot of problems in your field. So let's just quantify it briefly. This is from a recent article in Science Advances. We're talking about tens of thousands of dubious publications, dubious journals, and really a lot of problems in major journals, including the one that I work for, Science. Obviously, we've seen the problem of misconduct and image manipulation is really very widespread and a problem that the scientific community needs to take in hand. Now, we've seen an increase in retractions. That's really kind of important to show that there is a seriousness of purpose on the part of journals to start approaching this in a way that is appropriate to the great increase in detection of problems in these studies. So let's take a look a little bit at the reasons. I just actually look at the first line of this table, suspected fraud. Now, I want to just mention that there's always the issue of whether we're just noticing more these days or whether it's really occurring more. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's possible that it's being noticed more because there are better tools to notice it, and particularly with image doctoring, the digital tools for figuring out whether this has been done have been greatly enhanced by the increase in the resolution of those images in published papers. So a lot of times in the past, you couldn't really tell what was going on, and now you can. Very important. So why? Why is it an issue? It has deleterious effects on your work and on the advancement of the ideas that you're so deeply committed to. And it can be worse. It can exploit patients and does exploit patients. And it can jeopardize their safety and waste the funds that you desperately need to keep your labs going and to find new discoveries. Now, be assured that over the course of this talk, I'm going to address directly the particular situation we are going through in this country with the attacks on science, not just from people out there in the community, but also from even the directors and leaders of some of the leading federal science institutions. But before I get there, let's take a look at some examples that answer what I call the so what question. This is a problem that I've been looking at in Alzheimer's disease for several years now. And these three examples that I'm about to describe, I think, characterize why I think this is something we should be paying close attention to. So this is a guy at the University of Minnesota, Sylvain Lesne, who previously was at the University of Minnesota, I should say, who published what was in 2006 regarded as a seminal article about the importance of oligomer amyloid proteins in Alzheimer's disease. And the experiment that he published with his mentor, Karen Ash, had far-reaching influence and was not the only reason for a vast expansion of research associated with these oligomer proteins, but was an important moment when faith in the amyloid cascade hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease was suffering from discouragement associated with failure after failure of clinical trials. And this experiment, this basic science experiment, boosted confidence in that idea and led to a dramatic increase in funding for this type of basic research. And unfortunately, it was based on false images doctored improperly to suggest that the experimental hypothesis was true when it could not be shown in the actual data. And this article from Nature was eventually retracted after my story in Science exposed it, with the help, I might add, of forensic image experts who analyzed the images in that paper. So this is another example from an expert at the University of Southern California. His name is Berislav Slakovic, and he is an expert in stroke and Alzheimer's disease. The analysis by forensic image experts and by subject matter experts of his work showed that there was evidence of scientific misconduct in papers going back decades from his lab. A high-pressure lab that graduate students and postdocs from that lab told me was extremely difficult environment to deliver results that were not consistent with the expectations of Professor Zlakovic. Now, when my article came out about a series of these problems in his lab in 2023, 3 days later, NIH canceled a major phase 3 trial of a drug developed by Zlakovic's own company that seemed to be based on evidence that could not be verified as authentic, based on apparent image doctoring. And they clawed back the money from the university. Now, this to me was a cautionary tale of how bad it can get when these problems reach clinical experiments if based on suspect or demonstrably false basic science. Okay, this next example, to me this is one that perhaps trumps them all, and it involves a guy by the name of Eliezer Maslia, who was formerly the head of the Division of Neuroscience at the National Institute of Aging. And as you know from being scientists and trainees, this is the locus of much of the funding for the work that you do and that scientists all over the world do associated with Alzheimer's disease and other neurological conditions. And this is a really striking example because the analysis done by the folks that I worked with, the forensic image experts, and by my own reporting, showed that at least 132 of his papers were based on apparently doctored or misused scientific images going back decades, going back to his time as a professor at UC San Diego and continuing with his tenure as the leader of this ultra important division in the National Institute on Aging. This was a guy who was not just a bureaucrat, but he was a leader, a thought leader, and someone who was, as much as anyone in the bureaucracy, having a hand in deciding what science would go forward. So he wasn't just at the National Institute on Aging, he was also an influential scientist in his own right. So how do I know that? I did an analysis of his publications' influence. Now this is with regard to Alzheimer's disease. You see the keywords, as many of you would see immediately, that these are keywords that are central to understanding many of the ideas associated with Alzheimer's disease. Let me be clear, I know that influence is not just measured by the number of publications or citations. It's not everything, but it's something. It's something important when you have an individual who's in the top 10 for both of those categories for many of the most important terms associated with Alzheimer's disease and with Parkinson's disease. Very similar. So this is a guy who was influential as a leader in the field, influential as a scientist, as a bench scientist, and yet no one really paused to ask, was his science legitimate? I'm just going to give you an example of what this looks like concretely. For people that aren't familiar with forensic image analysis, this is one example. There are many different types, depending on what kinds of tools you're using as a scientist to measure your data. But this one, looking at micrographs, this is tissue of mouse brains. And so you see on the, see, I can use this. This image here is a regular young mouse, not genetically altered. This image is for an old mouse who's was genetically altered to produce copious amounts of tau protein associated with cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease. And then these images here and down below, these are the two images just brought out so you can see them side by side, and then they are merged in here. Now, this merge shows identical sections are displayed in yellow. And you see that there is a degree of identicalness in these tissue samples that is almost certainly not going to occur naturally. This was an example of one of, again, 300 pages of examples, 132 papers. And I might add, it's not that the team of forensic image experts looked at every single paper that this guy had ever written, all 800 of them. They stopped when they said, okay, we've got 132 papers. We've got enough. We've made our point. Okay, so what happened to this guy? So I'm really pleased to say that he was out of his job the day the story appeared. And that's because, naturally, as a responsible journalist, Maslia and NIH knew everything that I knew long before the story appeared. They were given every opportunity to comment and to give me their feedback and to prove me wrong and to add context that could change my ideas about it. I have to be intellectually honest the way I do my work, especially in situations where I'm questioning the intellectual and research honesty of individuals I'm writing about. They did not have anything to say to me, by the way, at this point until a couple days before the story actually appeared. NIH got in touch with me and told me they were going to have something for me. And they explained that Maslia was going to be gone. They synced it up with the release of my story, which first time that's ever happened in my career. And so obviously it's satisfying to have immediate results from a piece of journalism. Also incredibly discouraging that the agency itself never really took responsibility for this until that time. And here is what they said to me as part of their statement that I was finally able to get from them. And let me read it to you because it's so impressive. There is no evidence that such proactive screening would improve or is necessary to improve the research environment at NIH. So I ask you, could there be a more tone-deaf response? And honestly, it's very discouraging that the agency took that position. I don't know what their position would be today. They've been educated a bit by some of these experiences. So I want to just take a step back and talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease. That's been the primary focus of what I've been doing for several years. And I'm often asked, is Alzheimer's special? Is that why you're so interested in looking at it? Is it far worse than other fields of science? And I would say that no, it's not. It's not far worse. There's this kind of misconduct everywhere. Again, a relatively small percentage of all the scientists engage in misconduct, but it's enough to be influential in all fields. The difference is Alzheimer's is a particularly challenging problem. The brain, as you well know, is a particularly challenging problem of study for scientists and for doctors. And consequently, it's just a very tough thing to study. But when you have the combination of misconduct and a situation where there are no remedies that arrest or reverse this cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease, you have a particularly tragic set of issues that really are apart from heart disease or cancer or diabetes or other conditions for which there might be misconduct, but there's also great advances, cures even in some cases, and certainly great progress in the field. So I would say yes, Alzheimer's is a special case. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why does this happen? And to me, the key issue here is the roles and responsibilities of institutional authorities. The institutional authorities of science that are the gatekeepers of knowledge. NIH is one of them. I know from my reporting, and I'm sure other people know from their experience, that the study sections and administrators are not trained and do not pay attention to the possibility that they are receiving fraudulent applications. And I know it happens from people coming back to me and describing it. Unfortunately, they can't name names or provide the details because they're bound by the privacy and secrecy obligations of serving on a study section. Applicants, as we know, for top jobs are also not examined for integrity before they're hired. And I just want to emphasize again, these steps would protect you, the scientists who are trying to do this work honorably and correctly, and the vast majority of others in the field who are doing the same. The second important authority, institutional authority, FDA. So we know that FDA is under stress and under attack, and is also, you could say, I'm sorry to be using terminology that Donald Trump has used, but under attack from within even. And what we need to do is to address some of the problems at FDA in a thoughtful way. The revolving door issue, where executives preside over the approval of drugs and then go to work for companies and quintuple their salaries overnight, overseeing many of the same drugs or conditions that they regulated. This is really a bad look for the agency. It undermines public confidence, and it's something that I would say that criticisms by people like RFK Jr. have some merit here, even though, in my opinion, the way in which he handles these problems, the way in which he handles these dilemmas within the regulatory agencies are incorrect and ham-handed and often very destructive. There's often kind of a little grain of sensible truth in some of the questions that we need to be honest enough to address ourselves. I think the drug review process at FDA is problematic when you have drug companies like Biogen paying for the review of its drug Aduhelm, and then you have a hand-in-glove relationship with the agency that leads to a tremendously problematic relationship, what I would call a kind of corruption of the review process that results in a drug that is so unsafe and ineffective that it's pulled off the market soon after. And again, another problem of conflicts of interest on FDA advisory committees that I think we need to take seriously, but absolutely not the way that the federal government is doing it now with, for example, the wholesale dismissal of what was a very good advisory committee for vaccines. I want to make it clear that two things can be true at once. There can be problems of conflict of interest, and there can be good or bad solutions for how to manage those. So universities in the Office of Research Integrity, which, as you probably know, is an agency within the Health and Human Services Department that oversees problematic grants or misconduct in grants that were given by the federal government, particularly NIH. So the ORI, unfortunately, is being somewhat dismantled by the Trump administration. It is already weak and needs to be enhanced, not torn down. Now, with apologies, I have not looked closely at UC Davis's approach to misconduct investigations. So please don't take offense, take it personally. But there is a fundamental problem with universities being the ones to investigate their own folks, because the organization that has the most to lose and the least to gain from a robust, prompt, and publicly accessible investigation of possible misconduct is the one that has all that responsibility. And so what we've seen time and time again is heel dragging, inconclusive results, exoneration of professors that maybe should be exonerated, but sometimes in the face of enormous piles of extremely, extremely strong evidence to the contrary. What I'm saying is that the public has a right to have a better process, and one possible solution is to have independent, well-qualified independent agencies that are funded by universities collectively that can come in and provide an expert review with suitable due process for any credible allegations of possible misconduct that are referred by the Office of Research Integrity. So let's talk about journals. I work for Science, which is, of course, a leading scholarly journal, and I'm not sparing my concern about this because of that. Most journals are pretty unsophisticated about this. I'm glad to say that Science, Nature, and a variety of other leading journals are getting much better at it. They're using digital tools to try to enhance their ability to solve this problem and find possibly doctored images in research before they're published. One of the problems we find over and over again, though, is that I've told you the issue with the universities and the extremely slow investigations of possible problems within papers written by professors. And the problem that I find with journals is that they always or almost always defer to those universities. The university's looking into it, we're going to wait and see what they say. And this could take years. And then eventually a paper might be retracted, but it's already been in the record for all of that time. It's continuing to influence the scientific record and pollute the literature. And journals need to take more responsibility to do their own work. As we well know, we have a replication crisis in this country, in science generally, partly because journals are reluctant to publish negative findings or replication studies. There needs to be some reform in this regard. Also, there's an embarrassment factor for journals with corrections or retractions. And so just like there's an embarrassment factor for universities to be looking into their own people, journals don't want to deal with this because it reflects poorly on their selection of articles. I don't have really the time to talk in detail about paper mills, but this is a growing and huge problem in science where the fraud is being weaponized and mass-produced to some degree by technology and just by, essentially a kind of business. And there are problems with peer review. The peer review process has its own problems, and I'll give you one example from my own experience. Reviewers are not trained or asked to do this. So when I was working on the article about Bereslav Zlakovic, part of my journalistic process is to show my findings to subject matter experts, people who are leaders in the field who can say, okay, well, there may be problems here, but maybe this is really not very important, so there's no point. I don't want to write an article about things that are trivial, only about things that could be important and meaningful. And I'll never forget this one expert who I approached, and one of the key examples in the dossier that was prepared about this guy, Zlakovic, was he looked at the study and he said, kind of like this, slapped his forehead, and he said, I was a peer reviewer for this study, and I had no idea. And he said, I can see it's obvious now what happened, but we're not trained or asked to look at this. This has to change in peer review. There has to be some wisdom applied to the process that isn't being applied now. So here's a little test for you about AI, which is another emerging problem. So in each set of images, there's one completely normal, correct scientific image. These are nanotech images. And one image that was produced by AI program, whole cloth. In other words, completely fabricated. So just think about it for 1 second. Try to see if you can tell which one is which. Okay, so the top row are all real, the bottom row all fake. Now, below that, I show you the percentage of experts in this field who made the correct selection. This is sobering. This is sobering for a few reasons that I'm going to get into, but it's particularly bad when these experts can't tell the difference. You know that there are problems here that are going to be bigger problems in the future. This is the paper, by the way, if you want to look it up. It's a fascinating paper that came out quite recently in Nature Nanotechnology. So a little bit more on the AI arms race. So I use a program called Image Twin to do some of my reporting because it's a really amazing first step at assessing whether there may be image problems within a paper. And it's a great program and has done a lot to help basically in the arms race between the people who are trying to manipulate images improperly and the people who are trying to catch them in the act. It's been a great tool that has enhanced the ability of to do this better. But unfortunately, these tools like Image Twin, they really struggle with AI images. So far as I can tell, that's a huge weak point for them. Now they're going to get better, but there's going to be a lot of work that's going to have to go into figuring out how to manage this set of problems associated with AI. Okay, I want to talk for a second about the issue of what I would call perverse incentives in the academic system of promotion and success, because this is a meaningful part of what creates the tendency to cut corners. Look, you're in an incredibly competitive world, especially now with funding being cut and threatened. The idea of having to put out a lot of papers and to publish important papers, it obviously feeds, for people who are unethical, it creates an additional incentive to try to cut corners and do things that are improper. Now, I'm really happy to report that during my visit here, that UC Davis has some pretty good training programs for ethics, and that there is considerable interest in following the ethics guidelines as laid out by NIH, and maybe even going further than that in order to ensure that ethical approaches to science are kind of what you all not just believe, but is a routine part of your practice and, of course, what you would do. But in many universities all over the country, this is really not the case. It's a kind of a pro forma thing that is not really heavily emphasized. And because of that, because of this ultra-competitive system, you see that people start out slow and maybe make tiny changes that they think might enhance their ability to get a paper published that they feel they really need to get that next grant funded, and eventually find themselves doing more and more things to their data that are clearly improper and a form of academic fraud. So the unfortunate total of all this, and something that I feel concerned about, is that the institutional authorities of science have ceded some of their authority to people like volunteer image sleuths who post problems that they see to PubPeer and to other public forums in order to do something that it might be effective in calling attention to it. And I want to talk now a little bit about the underlying causes of this set of problems having to do with the culture of science. But first, I want to talk about my process and the necessity that journalists have to hold ourselves to the highest ethical standards. Now, here's what I mean. So I have to be very mindful of the fact that when I look at a body of work coming out of a lab, that there can be victims who are working in that lab and may even know about image doctoring or other forms of misconduct, but are very vulnerable for their livelihoods, their careers, and for the powerful force of the PIs within their labs. Conversely, sometimes it's overambitious trainee or postdoc who might be engaged in apparent misconduct, and the PI might not know anything about it. I'm not saying that the PI in that case is blameless, because that person may be complacent. They may be looking the other way because they derive great benefits from research that looks great but hasn't been carefully scrutinized. So I think out of fairness, you have to consider all these things. When I talk about fairness, I talk about the vital step of making sure that the person that you're writing about has ample opportunity to look at all the evidence and to have their say, not just because it's fundamentally fair as a journalistic exercise, and not just because I might have gotten something wrong, which I might, and I'd welcome that person to point out some contextual element or some false step or some mistake I made in order to write the clearest, most fair, and best story. But also because I owe it to my readers to give them that big view, the view that includes the commentary and discussion from the person who I'm writing about, so that they feel that the story has given them that comprehensive look at misconduct, possible misconduct, and the response. Finally, I just want to say that we're all human, including me, and I am subject to some of the same temptations, including expectation bias that happens to scientists and to people in all walks of life. And so I try to apply skepticism to my own assumptions, to challenge myself, and to ask my editors to do what I call a prosecutorial edit on my stories. In other words, challenge everything and anything to the degree of vigor that I am challenging the work of scientists I'm writing about. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about problems I see in the scientific community that I think need addressing. Arrogance is the first one. So I'm sure you all remember the March for Science in 2017. I covered that as a reporter. I'm sure many of you participated in that. And I'm sure you all look back with some regret at some of what I think many people are calling missteps and overreach, perhaps understandable in some cases associated with COVID recommendations. So when you look at the slogans, trust the experts and follow the science, I'm with you. I agree completely. But remember, there are some conditions on that trust. It should never be just assumed. And when it's not, when you see arrogance, complacency, condescension from the people who lead our scientific institutions or from top scientists, what you get is an understandable sense of anger from the public who don't understand the subtleties in these issues. People are very smart out there, even if they have wrong ideas. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but what I want to address now is another huge problem, in my view, in the world of scientific research, and that is conflicts of interest. Now, this is, again, from AGHELM. I keep repeating this example because it's so vivid and so appalling how bad the set of circumstances were with this experimental drug, which was later an approved drug. It was a drug anti-amyloid antibody for treating Alzheimer's disease. And this appropriate use recommendations were drawn by these authors, and you'll see they're very esteemed authors in the field. If you look at their financial conflicts of interest, these are disclosures made in this paper. And the yellow and blue highlights are the two companies that are the owners of the drug and that were the sponsors of all the trials associated with it. So for people writing a recommendations for use for this drug, this seems to me like a pretty extensive set of financial conflicts. I'm going to look at one individual, and because I'm a journalist, I have the opportunity to name names and be a little rude in the process, so apologies for that. This guy, Jeffrey Cummings, was the first author of that paper. He's an esteemed, highly regarded Alzheimer's scientist. Now, this is a record from the federal database of payments from drug companies. And if you look at the top line, it's about $1 million in the last few years from a variety of drug companies paying him for his expertise. 2 out of the top 3 were the 2 owners and sponsors of AGHELM, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this is not a minimal, de minimis, as they say, contribution to his livelihood. Also, I'd like to address professional conflicts of interest. Now, what I'm talking about here is a situation where you have 6 of the authors of that paper were also editors of the journal. So I want to talk a little bit about another problem that I see in the scientific community, and it involves me directly, so I hope you'll forgive me. But there have been a lot of critics of my work, and particularly of some of my writings about questions about the amyloid hypothesis, even though I've never said that amyloid proteins have nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease. I have often said they do not have everything to do with it. I have been criticized by some of the eminent scholars in the field with straw man arguments, lies about what I've written, and I think really self-defeating suggestions in today's world by suggesting that misconduct is more dangerous in a period of attacks on science than the misconduct itself. And I'm going to address that in a minute a little bit more directly. But if anyone wants to read more about this, I welcome you to weigh the evidence for yourself, to assess the meaningfulness of the concerns that I've raised in my book and in my articles. There's an article in Retraction Watch, which is pictured there on the right, and it's easily found with a Google search. And it also links to both the criticisms and to more detailed responses by me and others. So I want to put out what I consider to be a first principle for me in today's very, very difficult world. Like you, I revere scientific research. It is one of the most important things that human beings have ever developed. The scientific method is so vital for advancing human benefit. And we've reaped so many great rewards from it. But we need to be clear-eyed. Misconduct and the lack of responsibility taken by institutional authorities and the, I would say, terrible disregard for the importance of cleaning up the scientific record, it really invites public distrust. It feeds the very forces in society that you all feel victimized by and concerned about for your careers and for the benefits of your institutions. So let me be clear that my message is that 2 things can be true at once. We can know that it's vital to be open, honest, and extremely aggressive in fixing problems in scientific institutions and cleaning up the scientific record for everyone's benefit and for our public credibility, for your credibility with the very concerned and skeptical public. And at the same time, to fight the sabotage of science and the sabotage of universities by forces within the federal government in the current regime. So I have a few modest suggestions which I'm going to close with. And I want to suggest that when talking with doubters, try to show empathy and try to show humility. These are human beings who are smart and often have extremely misguided ideas, but there's really a good way to understand what's going on with them. Now, I want to just make reference briefly to a book I wrote many years ago that looked at another set of problems of public distrust in American science. And this was way before the period we're talking about now. This was literally, at risk of dating myself, was decades ago. And what I found, and I speak advisedly to say, people can be won over. Sensible arguments can prevail. Thoughtful listening and consideration of different ideas and respect can be a beneficial thing. I'm not saying I have a solution to the problems we're facing today, but what I am sure of is treating people with respect and empathy is a key element of whatever solution can be found. So very briefly, a few more modest suggestions. Conventional wisdom can be flawed sometimes. Respect renegades and critics and people who might be considered gadflies. at least hear them out and think about how their contributions might allow you to be skeptical of your own conventional wisdom. Again, stay in your lane. You know, being the smartest person in a particular field doesn't make you the smartest person in every field. And remember that more maybe than anyone, scientists and scientific trainees are harmed by misconduct. It is a pernicious force in your lives, one that degrades everything that you do and needs all of our support to try to fix. And finally, this is my mantra. So I really appreciate your time and attention.
We have time for questions.
First of all, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. In addition to all of the work that you have done in reporting on scientific integrity and, making sure that the public is aware of what we're doing and then also that we're aware of what we're doing. And then also congratulations on your book, Doctored. It's been, from what I've heard, it's been a great book and I'm starting to read it now. So first of all, great job on that. My question is, you work for one of the most prestigious, journals. Science is a name that everyone knows. It's, the journal that almost everybody aspires to publish, and it's the top-notch journal. What sort of steps have you seen science putting in to try and address some of the issues that you outlined today in terms of, journals, making sure that the peer review process is handled better, that the journals are actually, screening for those doctored images?
Yeah, so thank you very much for your comments. I really appreciate it. Well, just to be clear, I work for the journalism side of science, and I have nothing to do with the scholarly part of the magazine. But that said, I do happen to know that the magazine is taking these issues increasingly seriously, is screening every article with artificial intelligence software to do a first pass, again, as I mentioned, then putting human eyes on the images. So my opinion is they're doing a much better job than ever before. They take these issues of peer review very seriously. I can't give them a report card because I don't want to, actually. I'm biased. But I have to say that I have a lot of confidence in Holden Thorpe, who's the editor of Science. He's a person who has stood up for the issues of scientific integrity, I would say as much or more than any journal editor in the world.
Thank you very much. That was really good to hear. I want to build on the inherent reticence of institutions to try and police themselves. And in this particular context, I know that our colleagues at UCSD have passed a resolution that asks for basically nothing more than simple transparency when it comes to conflicts or potential conflicts of interest, which to many of my colleagues in this room might sound as a surprise because it's common practice among us to disclose, but it's actually not true across all disciplines in the academic space. As far as I know, that resolution was passed by the Senate, but I'm not sure it was adopted by leadership. I don't know if you're aware of that, and I wonder if you can comment on whether you think just a call for full-blown transparency is a good first step in trying to weaponize ourselves against the downsides of these very sordid tales that you are sharing with us that we all suffer from.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would agree completely that maximum transparency is almost always a great solution to some of these problems. So, for example, the federal system for reporting payments from drug companies to individuals is limited to clinical professions, nurses and doctors primarily. And I would love it for that same kind of scrutiny be given to PhD scientists. because we really need to know what that financial relationship is, and it's not being required to be reported. As I know from years of looking at disclosures and papers, these disclosures tend to be spotty. They're on the honor system. There's more attention being paid to it now by journals than ever before, and so I think it's getting better, but still it's not super reliable. But I would go beyond the financial issue. There's the issue of data transparency, and it's super critical for people to follow the NIH guidelines in a legitimate way and to make available data that can add confidence in your work, that can add transparency and trust of the public in knowing that this work was done to the highest standard. And I know that it's a lot of work, and it even can cost money to do that. So I think there should be funds provided to do that effectively. And I think the benefits of that would be enormous. I know there's some potential downsides to it as well, which I could talk about, but mostly I see it as a public good.
I just want to follow up on the point that you just made about submitting data sets and how crucial that is for certain scientific fields. Although it's not really followed all across, there is very unique standards in which every field develops on how data is submitted. Do you feel like from you looking at the number of papers that areas in which data is required to be submitted as a part of the standard of review has actually helped more transparency in the review process or helped in ensuring accurate results, or has that had no influence?
So I would just say thank you for the question. I want to stay within my area of expertise. So I don't know, I can't give you a general answer for that, but I do know of situations where extremely good practices of data transparency have resulted in papers being retracted because stuff was found in the raw data tables that could never have been looked at otherwise. And sometimes it's a very painful process for the professor who's behind the paper. And I know of a couple instances of this where a person, it's like no good deed goes unpunished. And so there is that factor. But I think in the long run and in general, this sort of data transparency is to everyone's benefit.
Hello. I was wondering if you could comment on the conflict of interest screening that is done on members of the FDA in the advisory panels in approving these drugs. I'm not 100% sure, but I think there was a lot of patient advocacy groups that pushed very hard for the drug you've been discussing to be approved, and just the general environment of pressure and conflicts in the people that make these decisions.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a mess. It's a mess because, as you say, the pressure groups, the patient advocacy groups, often for, I think, very good reasons, are really eager to see drugs approved by FDA, especially for rare diseases or diseases like Alzheimer's that don't have good remedies on the market. And so it's very understandable to me that there would be that pressure. But I think a lot of times there are ulterior motives. For example, with the patient advocacy groups, they are raising enormous sums of money to pressure their elected representatives and the FDA to push for drug approvals. And as a result of that, I think they feel enormous pressure to show results for their donors. And so I think often what you have is an irrational, thoughtless kind of pressure that is kind of a knee-jerk reaction to let's get something approved. So I think that's a huge problem. I think also the panels themselves, there are many reasons why people are allowed to participate on the panels, even if they have financial conflicts. And I think sometimes those are well warranted. In other cases, I think there's a kind of laziness on the part of the government of failing to do the work needed to bring in experts who do not have that degree of financial interest. So I would say it's a mixed bag, but also continual, consistent problem.
All right, we have one from our Zoom audience. First, she says, "Thank you for an outstanding talk. I see a difference between insufficient rigor versus fundamental dishonesty. Ethics and research conduct courses are useful for the former, but probably less impactful for the latter. Yet the latter is more problematic. What solutions would you propose? Perhaps an independent agency that conducts random audits on a small percentage of all publications?"
So that's an interesting question. So I'm not an expert in research in ethics training, so I don't want to go beyond my knowledge. But what I do know is that it is true that no amount of ethics training will deter someone who's deeply determined to take any measure to succeed. And so ethics training is not a solution, but it is an essential part of an overall program to reform the institutional authorities of science in a way that they can be more effective at their jobs. And their jobs include, very importantly, cleaning up and protecting the scientific record, the body of knowledge that we all depend on. So I know that's not a very satisfactory answer. I don't have a policy solution, but I know that both are required.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. Sorry, that was a bit loud. Just following up from a previous question, you said science is doing much better at screening journal articles that are being submitted for fraud. Is there any way that they can then put out a general alert, hey, this had fraud in it, and if the authors go and shop it to another journal that doesn't bother doing that kind of detection, it will prevent it from being published?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't want to get myself into too much trouble answering it. Honestly, I don't know what communications they might have about that, but I know that there are all kinds of legal questions about accusing someone of engaging in fraud when you find manipulated images. It's a complicated process. Fraud is a legal term, and journal editors are loath to use it. So you have to be careful, but I think there should be a system of understanding better when there's a pattern of behavior like that, and I don't think the journals have that at this point.
One last question.
Kind of based on what you were talking about with there's a lot of implications with finding fraud and calling it out. How do you find these stories? Like where do you begin? Does a scientist approach you? Like where do you start when you're investigating?
Yeah, thank you. So let me just briefly explain the primary ways that I've come up with these stories. One is that there aren't that many people, unfortunately, in journalism like me, that is, people who are specialists in investigative reporting about science and research. And so I do get a lot of tips. If something's going wrong, if something terribly unfortunate is happening in a lab, people will often come to me, or they'll come to a trusted intermediary who will then come to me. And so that's how some of my stories come about. But I'll explain very briefly an exercise that I went through as part of my book, Doctored, that proved central to building my overall understanding of the range and depth of the problem of misconduct in Alzheimer's disease research. And what happened is that I started with a question for the website PubPeer, and I asked them if they would give me 100% of all their data on any postings related to Alzheimer's or some related keywords. And so I ended up with a spreadsheet with thousands and thousands of lines. And then I started to analyze and interrogate that spreadsheet to find whether there were time and again individuals cropping up with questions that seemed well warranted about some of their studies who were within that field of Alzheimer's research. And so I came up with a very long list of people who had 5 or more examples already posted on PubPeer. And I used that to do an assessment of who was doing important, interesting research that was warranted a closer look, influential research. And what I ended up with were about 4 dozen examples of some quite important and some modestly important scientists who had some evidence of a serious enough problem to look more deeply. And then I began a year-long exercise with the enormous help of a group of forensic image experts who volunteered their time to assess thousands of papers from these folks to see if a few instances on PubPeer were reflective of a broader range of problems. And I winnowed down the list substantially because, again, the point is not to look at every example of something that went wrong, but to look at what was meaningful in the field that might have gone wrong, and to find out whether there was a pattern of behavior that warranted a deep look at that particular individual. And I want to give appreciation to the people who were the forensic image experts who were involved in this. And their names are Matthew Schrag, Kevin Patrick, Mu Yang, Elizabeth Bick, and I'm happy to say Mike Rossner, who's in this room today, so thanks for being here, Mike, who lent their time and expertise voluntarily to work with me to try to expose what was a more serious and pervasive problem in the field. Now, you can read the book and judge for yourself how meaningful and important these findings were, but what I know is that you have to try to approach this from different angles. Those are the 2 angles that I looked at that proved to be instrumental in finding some of the stories that I discussed today and many others that are in the book. So thank you so much for that question.
No further questions. Let's thank Charles Piller for a wonderful presentation.